Okay, Professor, we're online now. Okay,
Okay.
let's begin. It is it's going to be there. Okay. Okay. Good morning to everybody. Professor Carlos Aquino speaking. I am the director of the Center of Asian Studies at San Marcos National University. And in this occasion, we have the presentation by Professor Rosemary Hood of the theme China, the United Nations, and Human Protection. Just give me a minute to introduce quickly Professor Rosemary. Professor Rosemary is a very well-known scholar dealing with China. He's now he has now a Emeritus Fellowship of Science and Technical Policy from October 2014. She's a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Oxford, Department of Political and International Relations, and a Research Associate at the Oxford China Center. In 1996, she was elected a Fellow of the British Academy. Previously, Professor Rosemary Hood was Professor of International Relations at the Sir John Searle Senior Research Fellow in the International Relations of East Asia at St. Anton College. She has been a fellow of the college since 1990. During that time, she held the post of Director of the Asian Studies Center from 1994 to 1997. She is Senior Tutor from 2003 to 2005 and Active Warden from January to 2012. Professor Rosemary Hood has also held several visiting appointments over the course of her academic career in Australia, China, New Zealand, Norway, Singapore, and the United States. She has also published many books and articles in China, in East Asia, and one of the latest books she has published is China, the United Nations and Human Protection, Belief, Power in Nation, published by Oxford University Press just last year. And that is one of the reasons we have invited Professor Rosemary Hood to give an address to us. So we will let Professor Rosemary Hood to give her presentation. She will talk about 30 minutes, and then Ambassador Juan Carlos Capoñay will give some comments on Professor Rosemary Hood's presentation. Please.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor Aquino. I'm delighted to be here, and I hope to have a conversation about the book with not just with the ambassador, but with the wider audience if possible. So I'll try to stick to my 30 minutes. I want to show some PowerPoints, if that's all right. So if I may share my screen now, let's hope this works. And I hope, let me think. So, can you see my screen? No, you can't yet see.
Not yet for the screen. Yeah, it's going on.
Okay. Okay. So is that working well now? That's working better. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much. As you can see, this is the book. This is what it looks like, and I thought I would begin by giving you some sort of explanation of why I was drawn to this topic, and some of the sort of the wider reasons and some of the sort of research questions that lay behind it. If you look across my work, it's obvious that for quite a long time I've been interested in the implications that China's resurgence has had for global and regional order. And it's become one of the sort of central questions in international relations, which is my primary discipline. And that's reinforced in recent years, I think, because the Chinese leadership has talked about playing a larger role in global governance. I mean, it makes the point that it's got a good story to tell. It's got growing status, growing influence, not least because of its economic power. But also it argues that it's, as a major state in the system, it has sort of responsibilities, global responsibilities that it should fulfill. And so you have various statements where Xi Jinping speaks explicitly about China leading the reform of the global governance system. And if you look at this one, if you can see this, he talks about the pattern of global governance depending on the international balance of power. And that as the balance of power has shifted in the international system, so China should step up active participation. It should be participating in the formulation of global rules. It should be leaders in the process of global governance changes. So we've got numerous statements of that kind. So I show you that one and then another one here. He talks about leading the reform of the global governance system. This is just a couple among a number of statements that are made. And you see Beijing working in loose influence groups in order to attempt to promote this leading role, whether that's the like-minded group at the Human Rights Council or G77 in the General Assembly, the Belt and Road phenomenon, and so on. And I decided to explore this through a study of the UN because that multilateral body is a valuable platform for the articulation of Chinese ideas. And China has also emphasized very strongly that the UN has a core role in post-war order. And China's devoted increased resources to the UN as well. It's seeking higher level positions within the UN Secretariat. Chinese nationals now head 3 of the 15 UN specialized agencies. There's a Chinese special envoy to the Great Lakes region. They hold the directorship of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs and so on. But that more active engagement with the UN is surprising in a number of ways because it came at a time when the UN has taken on responsibilities that I think challenge Beijing's state-centric Westphalian vision of world order. And if I explain what I mean here, prominently from the start of the post-Cold War period, the Security Council appeared to move in a post-Westphalian direction and to privilege the UN's role in providing human protection. What I mean by that is it adopted a broadened concept of security and acknowledged that internal breakdowns of a state's security, as well as large-scale violence within a state directed at individuals, pose potential challenges to international peace and security. So it's a much broader definition of security than we were used to. And it's summed up in many ways in UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's discussion of sovereignty as responsibility. So there's a very famous statement of Kofi Annan's 1999. He says, in our contemporary reading of the UN Charter, we are more than ever conscious that its aim is to protect individual human beings, not to protect those who abuse them. And Kofi Annan obviously was deeply affected by developments in Rwanda in 1994, and of course the former Yugoslavia, the breakup of the former Yugoslavia over the course of the 1990s. Now, by human protection, these are the issues that I cover in the book. So things like protection of civilians in armed conflict, the women, peace and security agenda, R2P, responsibility to protect. I do a case study on Syria, and I also look at the Chinese arguments about the relationship between development and human protection. I also spend time on activities within the Human Rights Council. And what I'm doing with my study of these issues is to try to uncover some thoughts and understanding of some bigger questions of interest in the field of international relations and actually of interest to the policy world. So if these questions, if this area of human protection is one that actually is a challenge to China's state-centric view, then how is China dealing with it? Is China trying to reshape an international organization like the UN from within? Does Beijing if it is attempting to shape this idea of human protection, is it trying to challenge the more liberal dimensions of liberal order associated with the idea of human protection? Is China trying to make a world safe for autocracy, as some scholars are arguing? And to what extent, if that's true, does this make this a world that's less safe for democracy? So these are sort of some of the larger questions that come out of this focus on human protection. But if I take a step back, perhaps, and look at the research puzzle, what was my initial research question? As I've suggested already, I was intrigued by the fact that China has become more deeply involved in the work of the UN at a time when the UN has moved beyond its Westphalian principles into an area where it's focused on human protection. So my decision to focus on human protection is because it's an idea that invites normative contestation for a government like China's that privileges the security of the state and the political regime above that of the security of the individual. And so you've seen this interesting juxtaposition of China's increased involvement in UN activities at a time when the UN has been changing. So my next research question was, how has China been working within international institutions like the UN that are playing this defining role in the post-World War II global order, and that have taken a direction that actually challenge China's core beliefs? In terms of my approach to this, I'm very sympathetic to methodological approaches that explore the social construction of reality, the social context in which decisions are made. So what I'm arguing is it's not material factors on their own that are important here, but the social meanings ascribed to them. So what I'm arguing in terms of the subtitle of my book is that there's a sort of a mutually constitutive relationship between China's power, that is its material power that generates social influence, and its concern for international image, particularly this image as a responsible great power or responsible major state, as it sometimes calls itself, which is important to it to both domestically and internationally, and shades its positions on, shades its perspectives on the positions that it takes, and how that also relates to its ideological beliefs that derive from several different phases of China's political progression, and that coalesce around the idea that a governing authority's success requires strong centralizing institutions, social harmony, and recognition of the larger social value of economic development. So it has the power to advance these kinds of ideas. It also has a particular image that it wishes to project. And I'm arguing that the dynamic nature of Beijing's policy responses in this political environment of the UN helps us to explore how it is dealing with a post-Westphalian order. And I'm hoping that the empirical work that the chapters in the book illustrate show an attempt by China to reconstitute what is meant by a responsible great power in global politics. The broad findings of this research are that China is offering an alternative set of understandings, alternative, I would argue, to dominant UN understandings, at least among the UN Secretariat, about how best to give effect to human protection. And I mean, again, I'm going to represent this in pictorial form. So this is the typical structure that we associate with the UN, the three-pillar structure, the essential interrelationship as embodied in the Charter between development, peace and security, and human rights. And if you have these three things in place, you are able to promote the core goals of the UN. And the UN Secretariat often talks about the UN's three-pillar structure as being the vital underpinning of UN action. China, on the other hand, I'm suggesting, has an alternative model. I call it a triadic model in the book, but it's not a term that Chinese scholars or Chinese officials use. And I'm arguing in the book that it believes that this particular structure, I'll show you it now, is superior to the UN's three-pillar structure. And I would argue that this particular idea has been expressed more forcefully since the start of the presidency of Xi Jinping. And the emphasis is very much on the benefits of interrelating economic development, strong state, social stability, on the understanding that if you have these three components in place, this will better guarantee international peace and security, and therefore will guarantee or better guarantee protection of peoples. So this model obviously downplays the significance of human rights in contrast to the place given to rights within the UN's three-pillar structure. And it also downgrades a role for an independent civil society, because the emphasis on social stability means that civil society is essentially seen as a guided phenomenon. Civil society is guided by governing institutions. So if I put this in a slightly different way, again, this slide, if I draw out in this slide a couple of concepts, sovereignty and security, you see some of the differences between China's view, perspective on this, and the UN perspective. Although by the UN, I'm really referencing the United Nations Secretariat here. I'll have more to say about the UN and the complex nature of its makeup later on in the talk. What I'm saying, I suppose, is that the table suggests a Beijing that's putting forward some different perspective, different emphases, very state-centric, very much a view of international peace and security, that if there is no sort of regional consequence or wider consequence of an outbreak of violence, then the Security Council essentially shouldn't be involved. Beijing's constituency of support for this model is in fact quite large. So there is something of a tussle going on, if you like, a tension between some of the countries represented within the UN and some of the ideas that have come out of the UN Secretariat, particularly in the post-Cold War era. So China has developing country support, in part because of the economic leverage that it has, of the economic largesse, as we were saying earlier, the fact of China as a leading trading partner, an aid partner, and investment partner, but also as a result of the demonstrable economic success that it's had in sustaining high growth rates over the years, and of course bringing some 800 million Chinese out of absolute poverty, as many of the economic organizations within the UN itself often reference this remarkable transformation of China. And there is also an alignment, I think, in views among a large number of states within the UN system and China about the dangers of an intrusive UN agenda seen in the way that human protection idea can operate. So it's also vital to note that China doesn't always have to act. There can be an alignment of values between the PRC and many UN member states, which immediately raises questions about the kind of normative order that the UN actually represents, the extent to which it raises questions about the extent to which the post-Cold War, post-Westphalian framing that I described near the beginning of this talk, the extent to which that has actually taken root. And then that raises questions in turn about the extent to which Beijing genuinely represents a challenge to this component of global order. Let me turn also to some of the specifics of policy that China puts forward in support of its triadic model. In this slide gives you some idea. So if we turn to human rights, there is a great emphasis on development as a kind of foundational right, that you have to focus on improvement in subsistence, in development levels, in reduction of poverty, and so on, as a foundational right. And then you can turn to other rights. Again, that's very different from the kinds of things that are reflected, I would argue, in the Charter or in other parts of the UN. There's a very much more of an emphasis on collective over individual rights. And there's strong emphasis on the sovereign state as the provider and the protector of rights, rather than rights being something that individuals claim, often against the state and often against an abusive state. In terms of thinking about civil society, again, as I said earlier, instead of thinking about civil society as the UN does, as a source of independent information, as a means of accountability, as a view that if civil society groupings are brought into decision-making, that aids the sustainability of outcomes, China puts much more emphasis on the host state guiding civil society groups, essentially. They provide the room, the space, if you like. It's determined at the state level the role that the civil society, the non-state actor, might play. And again, conflict prevention, if you look at Chinese statements and policies, the emphasis is very much on development as the source of conflict. And therefore, the most important thing is to build the capacity of the government in power in order to reduce threats to human protection. Whereas, again, the UN would say, yes, of course, we must address underdevelopment, but we also need to think about the reform of political, legal, security institutions. We need to think about inclusiveness. We need to think about the protection of human rights. So if I could give you a specific example, in the Women, Peace and Security agenda that has a prominent role at the United Nations, China discusses that issue as a kind of women's rights and development issues. And as I said, as far as China is concerned, rights and women's, that includes women's rights, are the prerogative of the government in power, or at most something of international concern for the Commission on the Status of Women. And women's empowerment becomes something that should be promoted through the development arm of the United Nations, rather than in the wider remit that is part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. If you look at something like the international human rights diplomacy at the Human Rights Council, China tends to emphasize two norms in particular that focus on the universality, that challenge the focus on the universality, indivisibility of human rights. They affirm the sovereign equality of states. They talk about non-interference in internal affairs as the most important norms providing order in the interstate system. And China, for the first time from 2017, started to introduce its own resolutions at the Human Rights Council, which were about the contribution of development to the enjoyment of all human rights. Again, putting development as a kind of foundational right that we have to get right, first of all, before we can move on to other forms of protection. Let me say something also about, if I have time, I don't want to go on longer than half an hour, the R2P question. So again, the responsibility to protect put forward at the United Nations in 2005, 2009, an implementation structure was put forward. Now, the Chinese perspective on this is to say that it's the state's responsibility to protect its population from the 4 mass atrocity crimes that are associated with the idea of the responsibility to protect. Whereas the emphasis in the R2P 2005 World Summit Outcome document was very much that the state should adhere to the notion that it must address mass atrocity crimes and must prevent the movement towards mass atrocity crimes. The Pillar 2 idea is about responsibility of the international community in helping states protect their populations from mass atrocity crimes. The Chinese formulation is very much saying, be responsive to the expressed needs of the host government, what it would argue that it needs in order to build its capacity, in order to ensure the prevention of the development of mass atrocity crimes in different circumstances, and also the government itself to determine if it needs help. So again, the emphasis is on host state consent, whereas the original idea of the responsibility to protect is that the international community, through the Security Council, needed to be responsive when there were indications that a state was involved in mass atrocity crimes and there was a failure to address and reverse those mass atrocity crimes. So the idea of consent was not part of that original formulation. It could be intervention against the wishes of the government in power. And then the Pillar 3, China puts the emphasis on negotiation and dialogue between conflicting parties, whereas Pillar 3 in the original R2P formulation was its responsibility of the international community to take timely and decisive action to address atrocity crimes where a state was manifestly failing in its duty of protection. So you can see that there is this kind of challenge. There is a sense of the original formulations with respect to an idea such as responsibility to protect and the 3-pillar structure. There is a challenge that China and other states, not China alone, but China and other states has mounted to this R2P idea, and so that it has begun to be shaped and understood as something rather different from the original intention of R2P. Okay, let me move to some final points. The successful promotion of its model. This, in many ways, there are UN-related and some rather more diffuse reasons for the UN and Chinese positions coming closer together over time. And I would argue that's in part because there's been greater attention by UN Secretaries General and by the UN specialized agencies to the relationship between conflict and underdevelopment. And the effect that has on human protection. So I'm thinking of things like the studies such as the World Bank's 2003 report on the causes of civil wars, which put a great emphasis on the role of underdevelopment in causing conflict and in promoting a recurrence of conflict, and therefore diminishing protection levels for human beings. Successful promotion of Chinese ideas because the setbacks and difficulties of enacting the UN's very complex human protection agenda. It's very difficult to do protection of civilians in armed conflict when perhaps tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of civilians are seeking UN protection in various ways. And I think China has also been aided over the last few years because of a relative decline of Western influence within the UN system and within the global governance system more broadly, particularly the diminution of the Western presence in UN peace operations. And of course, this was particularly notable during the Trump presidency. There is some repair in terms of US-UN relations now that Biden is in power, but there is no doubt, I think, that US status as a result of its actions at home, as well as within international institutions, has damaged its influence across the greater UN. There's also the question of China's contribution of resources to the UN organization, particularly since 2015, including funding, second largest contributor to the overall budget, second largest contributor to the peace operations budget, the setting up of a China UN Peace and Development Trust Fund, linking the Belt and Road Initiative with the UN Sustainable Development Goals agenda for 2030 and so on. All of this indicates that China has put resources into the United Nations, and that has resulted in increased influence. And I think also, if we turn to China more broadly, it has been using its material strength and has been using its rhetoric, if you like, to emphasize its particular domestic successes, particularly this year, of course, the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the CCP. It's been expressing confidence in its own model of development in a way, I think, that was not true in the past. And it's reflecting that confidence when it talks about how human protection can best be guaranteed. And as I said before, this sort of developmentalist ideological belief does find some traction with other states. And that seems to be particularly the case within the UN's Human Rights Council and with respect to R2P, because many states in the UN system, of course, share this post-colonial identity, which links China with a number of different parts of the developing world. But I don't want to leave you with the impression there isn't some resistance to this. There clearly is. If you look at UN reports, then although they acknowledge the important role of development, particularly sustainable development, and the diminution of conflict, they also argue very strongly that human rights protections are part of that, need to be part of that provision in order that you can actually have a sustainable peace. And civil society groups remain vibrant in many of the societies in which China operates and are viewed as vital to the work of the United Nations. China, if I could just give you one example, a UN World Bank study of 2018 called Pathways for Peace, it argued that yes, growth and poverty alleviation are crucial, but alone will not suffice. What's needed also are inclusive political institutions, adapted macroeconomic policies, institutional reform into core state functions, redistributive policies. So attention to, if you like, justice and inclusiveness, very much still part of a UN message. And also even on something like R2P, although, as I suggested, China has managed to shape the way in which R2P is thought about within the UN system, it hasn't been able to stop all reference to it, and neither has it been able to stop R2P becoming a part of the annual formal agenda of the General Assembly, even though China has consistently voted to keep the discussion of R2P at the informal level within the General Assembly. And again, even within the Human Rights Council, where China has a powerful voice, against Chinese wishes, the Council established, for example, an independent investigative mechanism on Myanmar to collect evidence of violations of international humanitarian law. The Gambias took the question of Myanmar to the International Court of Justice, again, something that China didn't want to see happen. With respect to North Korea too, that's been the subject of damning reports from a Human Rights Council mandated commission of inquiry. So China too, of course, has been subject to criticism as a result of developments in Xinjiang and the Muslim minority Uyghur population there. It's been voted back onto the Human Rights Council several times, but that the numbers of votes in favor of its participation have decreased over time. So if I go back to the main screen, if I can I do that? Okay. So if I could go back to the main screen and just to say, so what can you draw from the conclusion to this complex study? And as I've tried to explain it rather briefly today, China, yes, is both aided and constrained, I would say. It's aided primarily because the United Nations represents more than one kind of international order. There is the UN of the Secretariat that has a kind of aspirational role. There is a UN of the member states that are divided among themselves in many ways, but reflect particular constituencies and particular sets of beliefs. And then there's the UN of the civil society organizations, which are still, although they may be under some threat, are still an important voice within the UN venue. So because of that complex makeup of the United Nations itself, it's very difficult, therefore, to conclude that Beijing is either a revisionist power or a status quo power. It's a challenge in certain areas of policy, but the degree of challenge depends on which parts of the United Nations system that you're thinking about. What kind of UN would the PRC prefer? In my view, I think it would, if it acquires greater authority within the UN system, it has greater influence, including the acquisition of higher level positions within the Secretariat. I think we might see a UN that's a bit more reminiscent of the 1980s, actually, a rather more conservative body, more of an interstate governance mechanism, where governments decide on priorities. The international community, if you like, is seen as an enabler of the government in power, rather than a kind of an independent force in world politics. So a rather minimalist, state-based conception of global order, where the international community, in some senses, is reduced to a resource rather than as a partner. And I think that overplays the notion that choices determined at the central governmental level are going to resolve the issues that we are faced with in terms of the global commons, issues of obviously climate change, counterterrorism, health pandemics, the spread of nuclear weaponry, and so on. These are global challenges, and I think putting too much emphasis on what the individual state can contribute to those sorts of policy areas means that we are in a very thin era for multilateralist bodies like the United Nations. So I'll leave it there, Professor Aquino. I hope that was relatively clear, and I probably tried to cover too many aspects, but anyway, I look forward to your reactions and responses. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Professor. It was very good. It was really, really very interesting to have put very clearly, no? Sometimes different concepts like China and the United Nations deal with some language, for example, no? I was, for example, in one of the things that you mentioned in what you call it, China's successful promotion of small, you gave some reasons, and you said United Nations related reason, and you mentioned the relative decline in Western influence within the United Nations. For example, when the United States and the Trump administration withdrew from the United Nations Human Rights Council, some people said that was very bad for the United States. The United States was supposedly the champion of human rights, but itself, the United States withdrawn from that. But I understand that the United States is going to be back, you know, in 2 days. I was reading in 2 days on Wednesday, Biden again will bring back the United States, the United Nations Human Rights Council. And another thing that was also very interesting to listen about the difference or emphasis in how China, United Nations see human rights. Also that you mentioned, I remember in December 1985, the United Nations adopted the United Nations Declaration of the Right of Development, okay? I remember it well because I was invited for a conference in China in December. And I was just, because of this conference, I was reviewing the United Nations Declaration, and I will read two articles. I am copying it. There's Article 1. The right to development is an inalienable human right, by virtue of which every human person and all people are entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. But many people, when we talk about human rights, they said, oh, freedom of expression. Really? But I guess what China is putting more emphasis is on what this United Nations Declaration of the Right to Development is, what is writing in Article 8. What was it? States should undertake at the national level all necessary measures for the realization of the right to development and shall ensure inter alia equality of opportunity of all in the access to basic resource, education, health service, food, housing, employment, and the fair distribution of income. And I think, and I guess you also mentioned, in this regard, in this aspect, China can show, no, we are doing this. We are not just having declaration of human rights. We're doing complete steps to fulfill the human rights. That point for me is very, very interesting. Anyway, I will give the floor to, you want to comment on that? Anyway, I will give the floor to Ambassador Juan Carlos Capuñay. Ambassador Juan Carlos Capuñay is a member of our center, advisor also of our center. He has been ambassador of Peru in Japan, China, Singapore. He was executive director of the Asia Pacific Cooperation Organization, and he knows a lot about the region and specifically about China. Please, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Carlos, for this opportunity, and thank you very much to the Professor Food for the presentation. Very interesting, and the way how China is interacting, how it's working within the framework of the United Nations. Definitely, when we talk about the relationship of China with the UN, we have to mention that this year is quite very important for China in the relation with the UN. This year, China celebrated the 50th anniversary of the restoration of the China lawful seat in the United Nations. In such occasion, in the framework of the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, the President Xi Jinping made a proposal, quite very important proposal, named Global Development Initiative, GDI, which is, in my opinion, a program, very wide-oriented program to the establishment of a new international order. The new, the international order that we were talking in the 1970s, from the time of the G77, that has been overpassed. This new initiative, the GDI, the Global Development Initiative, represent a number of measures, a number of programs in order to establish a new kind of relationship within the countries, including the human rights aspect. We can say, for example, this GDI has in its agenda many of the points that the professor has mentioned, the China policy oriented to the development of the people. According to the, according to the GDI, the first, the different points are: first priority has to be the development of the nation. Second aspect is the people's social policies, the approval of different measures of policies oriented to the people's development. The third aspect is development of the science and technology and innovation as a vector for the development of the countries. Then social inclusion. Then no confrontation, I mean complementary and or interdependence, no Cold War. These new order are definitely will contribute to a better complementary of the economies, to the some cultural conditions, the peace and international security, the globalization and the integration and connectivity. This could be, the new framework toward the issue of the not, of the development, economic and social development, including cultural, economic, and social rights or human rights of the people. And then that's why when we see, when I saw this proposal, I imagined that this could be the new agenda post-pandemic, the agenda after the human mind, after the international society, after the mankind were over to cover the, the pandemic or the pandemia situation. It could be, the new agenda or the agenda in order to have, the second stage over the, over the development goals of the millennium. The 2030 agenda. After we were able to cope the 2030 agenda, this GDI will be a good foundation from now on in order to reinforce the millennium goals and in order to reinforce the post-COVID-19 agenda for the whole world. From my point of view, the policy or the approach of China related to the issue of human rights within the United Nations and from the also, from the national point of view, could be approached from from 2 points of view. And the professor has mentioned in very, in details about the, the international aspect. Let me talk about also about the national aspect. This, these two approaches are the macro perspective. It's about the international perspective right or the international perspective of the social right, of the social development of the people, basis on the, a basis on a very interaction of among the three, among the three pillars of the international scenery. Could, let's say, the nation, let's say civil society, and let's say the international organization. Three of them, they will have to work together in order to prepare some policy or in order to promote policies to improve the welfare, the income, the social inclusion, and to promote the the better relation among nations. The 230 or 2030 Millennium Development Goals Plan of the United Nations contains many of these measures of this macro perspective. But what I would like to mention is about the micro or the Chinese perspective on the human rights development. When we see about the human rights situation in China, what we have to understand is about the efforts of the Chinese government in order to establish what they call a modern socialist country with Chinese characteristics. It contemplates or it includes a number of measures approved since 1979, since the year of the open. Thanks to this measure adopted since 1979, today 99 million of people has left the extreme poverty line. It is the largest number of population has been that that has improved, that have improved the lower income, that have improved the social needs, that have improved the cultural living standards. It is very important because the policies of the Chinese government has been oriented to develop the cultural needs of the people, the cultural understanding among the different groups of people, the different region or province in China. That also has been included a number of policies in order to improve the living standard of the people. Now, most of the people live in the big cities, or most of the people who live in the big cities, they live in a better condition. Most of them, they have a high level standard of life. The income is very high. By the year 2025, the middle class group in China will be 500 million, will be the highest middle class group in the world, with the highest income. Since the year 2019, the GDP per capita goes over $10,000, and the personal income is over $5,000. I remember when I visited China for the first time, when I was posted at the Peruvian embassy in 1973, when the Peruvian embassy in Japan in 1973. When I visited China, of course, I didn't see, the China of 1840, when China was under the foreign domination. That was very tremendous time in those days, tremendous poverty, tremendous exploitation. What I saw in 1973, it was a poor country. It was a poor country, but it was not misery country. If I was comparing with the Western society, I was able to see poor people, poverty in China, but I was not able to see misery. People were not, struggling or, fighting on the war, fighting on the street for, just to survive. What I saw was a people, happy people. They used to dance I was there on summer. They used to dance at night at some kind of a social groups, under the bridge, in the parks. And everyone was happy because all of them has something to eat, a place to live, and some clothes to wear. The situation after 72 years, since 1949, the situation is quite different. China today is the second worldwide, economy. Right? Is the second economy worldwide. Is the second economy in terms of income, in terms of production, in terms of financial assistance to other countries, and that's why it is very important to notice that in China, the situation of the human rights or situation of the social development is quite important. If you and it has quite important result if you see how the Chinese people live today and how the Chinese people used to live. Let's not say in 1840, let's say 1950, 1960, or before 1949. Today the largest tourism group in the world is the Chinese group. Everyone wants to attract the Chinese tourists because they have the highest, expenditure level in terms of purchasing, in terms of buying. And it is important also to mention that this, this process of protection of the human rights in China has been created a number of laws that will that provide the guarantees, the necessary guarantees to the people in China for the for the exercise of their own rights. For example, there is a law was mentioned about the about the level or the quality of education. Now everyone has the right to have the access to the free education. And today the students that finalize the education, the school education in China, they receive the qualification or the qualification in order to be accepted for any European university. That doesn't happen in many other countries. Also, the use of the written or spoken language. Every language it is respect, and it is respect by law. No, the employment law that open the employment opportunities to everyone. And also, which is very important, is the law of regional, ethnic autonomy groups. All the regional ethnic groups are protected and are promoted by the law in China. What I can see is that today there is a new normal in terms of social development in China. There are very tight, very firm regulation about corruption. There is no corruption anymore. It is punished by the government, and the Chinese people understand that situation because it will, it will guarantee the better access of the people to all the opportunities of life with no corruption. Then there are social reforms that has been approved in order to guarantee a better standard, better life for people. When I was in China recently as an ambassador in 2014, I remember I was quite impressed about what they call the urban development laws or urban development decisions. It's the way how they created the cities and how they promote to the people from the rural area to come to the cities, and they provide all the facilities, all the convenience for the life. And it's also, this new normal is about an open society. People can now move from one social, let's say, social group to the next one. I mentioned about the 99 million of people left the extreme poverty, but 500 million will move from the low income to the middle class income, and they will represent a very important market, very important opportunity for other countries. Another, another result of this new normal is about the open and free economy. They have what they call today, a program approval by the government. What they call, they call that the dual economy. What says the development of the countries are not based only on its own forces, but also in the interaction that they have with another countries, in the dual economy. That's why in China, for example, since 3 years ago, what they have is what they call the International Fair of Importations of Products, which is very important for economies like Peru. It is not it is not fair to present export of China to overseas. It is a fair, or it is an event to introduce import products to the Chinese people. That kind of event contribute to the income of the Peruvian people or to the income to the other developing countries, because we have the opportunity to export our product. And then also that there is, in terms of our regulation, there are two main, reference point or reference framework. One of them is the International Congress, or no, the International Congress, the 18th International, the 18th National Congress, National People's Congress. And then what they call the 14th Quinquennial Plan, that include a number of decisions or number of regulations that will facilitate the improvement of the life standards, the improvement of the human rights of the people, and the most important thing, it will increase the opportunities, or the number of opportunities that the people will have in order to develop by itself. China today represents an open economy. China today represents an opportunity for the development of its own people, but the most important thing from the perspective of Peru and the other countries is that China represents an open economy, an open country that will give opportunities, that provide opportunities to other countries. That's why that's why I said at the beginning, 2021 is a very important year for China relation with the United Nations, because the proposal of the President Xi, the Global Development Initiative, the GDI, it will guarantee not only the economic cooperation to other countries, but also guarantee the cultural, the social and economic rights of the people. The project of the Belt Road Initiative that the professor mentioned is based on a cultural understanding. It is not a single model to be applied. It is an understanding among all the members. Each country define or identify its own priorities and its own objectives. The other members cooperate, and the China system cooperate in order that this country will be able to implement it or to accomplish the goals or the objectives that they have with their participation in the BRI, in the Belt Road Initiative. It is very important also that another, that another mechanism that China is now implementing is two of them is together with the BRICS country, they have the new development bank that to finance the projects, social project, cultural project, economic project for other countries. And also they have the Asia Infrastructure Development Bank that also provide the assistance for the countries to to accomplish their development and social goals. I think that this is what I can see how China contribute in the work with the United Nations from the with this proposal with the GDI, how China contribute to the development of the international community through this financial institution, and how China contribute to the consolidation of the international security, trying to promote understanding instead of confrontation, trying to promote integration, and complementary instead of Cold War. This is what I was trying to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Capoñez. Very interesting comment, and especially you remember us, the initiative, the proposal that President Xi Jinping gave about the Global Development Initiative in the 70th section of the United Nations Assembly. Yeah, I was checking it, and again, as we have already talked, President Xi Jinping emphasized that protection and promotion of human rights through development. Really, this is a kind of China idea. And yeah, they also, you said something very important. This year, it is the year, 50 years ago, that China became again, the People's Republic of China became again the sole representative of China. And you don't know probably, Professor Rosemary, but Peru was also celebrating the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the diplomatic relation between Peru and the People's Republic of China. Peru was the third country in Latin America to recognize the People's Republic of China as the sole representative of China. Okay, so we give back the floor to Professor Rosemary. Perhaps you have something to comment, Professor? Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, and thank you very much for your reactions to it. And it's very interesting the way it has coalesced around ideas of development, obviously. And you began, Professor Aquino, talking about the right to development, 1985, and so on. And then, of course, the ambassador gave us a much broader view of China's development model and also what is offered to the world in terms of global public goods and so on. So it's very valuable. I think there's so much to say, but we don't have unlimited time. I'm going to sort of divide my comments into three sections, I think. First of all, I want to talk about that, yes, we do have two covenants. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights gave birth to two covenants, one economic, social, and cultural rights, and the other political and civil rights. And I, for one, believe in the universality and the indivisibility of all those rights. And I agree with the general thrust of the idea that economic, social, and cultural rights need to be given greater prominence, or at least equal prominence with civil and political rights, because I see these things as a composite whole and important and reinforcing each other. So I would argue for that, but I would also suggest that we need to be aware that China actually is not in favor of the idea of the indivisibility of human rights. It's actually what it is doing is saying that development is the solution to all problems. I mean, I'm actually quoting Chinese leaders. Development is the solution to all problems. And development is not thought of as a right, but as something that the government decides upon. It's not that it sort of seeks, if you like, or allows individuals and groups to argue for particular forms of developmental processes. What it does is determine the policy at the central governmental level. So it doesn't operate as a right inside China. Development is an imposition, a welcome imposition in some cases, a less welcome imposition in other cases. I also don't think that development is the solution to all problems, that in order for human beings to thrive, they need many other things in their lives, the ability to freely express their ideas, to gain information, to live a life of dignity, to live in a way that they would like to be able to live, not something that's subject to central control. I also think that to put this in another way, I think that the ambassador in many ways overstates Chinese successes and is too optimistic about ideas such as the Belt and Road Initiative and the Global Development Initiative. It would be great if it would unfold in the way in which it was described at the United Nations by Xi Jinping, or the way in which you have described it tonight. but many of those policies actually do not get implemented in the way that is maybe intended. They're operating in very complex societies, some of which they understand, some of which they don't understand at all. If you look at China's own development model, it's become, and Xi Jinping has admitted this himself, one of the, if not the most unequal society in global politics. It's even more unequal than the United States. Li Keqiang, the Chinese premier in 2020, talked about 600 million Chinese living on less than $140 US a month. So less than $5 a day. And he remarked on the fact that the Chinese actually have so much still to do. And much of what they have done has been extraordinarily costly. One thinks about, for example, the high levels of pollution within the society. This is air pollution, water pollution, pollution of the soil, so that there is a real fear inside China about food security and about what you can trust in terms of standards, in terms of contagion of particular food products that you might adopt. If you think about something like the Belt and Road Initiative, that initially came out of a sense that the Western parts of China needed to be more fully developed and therefore linked with West Asia, and needed to be linked in terms of infrastructure of various kinds. It also came out of the fact of overproduction of materials inside China, and therefore certain of these products had to be exported overseas because they couldn't, because there was an overabundance of materials inside China. So one of the associated elements of the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, has been the export of coal plants overseas. So while China moves forward with its attempts at sustainable development, at non-fossil fuel development and the like, although it still relies 70% on coal to fuel its productive capacity and its energy requirements, it exports coal plants overseas as a direct opposite of the kinds of things that the Chinese leadership has stated it intends to do in terms of climate change goals and the like, as it states at UN fora and the like. But that particular decision to export coal plant overseas has led to enormous disruption of Belt and Road projects and difficulties in a number of countries, with a number of governments actually having signed up to these particular deals, so that there is actually instability in these countries as a result of the type of deals that they've solved. So there is a sense in which I see China as a major economic actor, as a development partner, as a society undergoing astonishing transformation. On the one hand, there is much to congratulate, but we have to be open-eyed and also look at some of the costs that have been associated with that model. So the idea that you can promote a Chinese model without actually discussing the costs and consequences for communities that have come alongside that model, I think is extraordinarily unfair in terms of the development process. It's put forward very much as a smooth, linear model that has just seen growth, growth, growth. But actually it's been a very disruptive and violent period in Chinese history since 1949, which has led to remarkable transformations on the one hand, but also enormous hardship for large numbers of people within the country. Yes, large numbers live a better life than was certainly the case in the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, and so on. But at the same time, there have been costs involved in that transformation. And what I object to, I think, is this projection on the part of the Chinese leadership of a model that essentially has relied on the wisdom of the Chinese Communist Party. It's moved forward very smoothly. It's actually relied very heavily on underpaid workers, on very difficult working conditions, only now beginning to be addressed. And that's sort of one of the things that China could offer, if you like, for those countries currently concerned with economic development and currently concerned to advance their economic life chances, is to actually talk about the things that they should not have done, as well as the things that they have done right. And I think if that was the case, that it would be a much more persuasive discussion that China would be having with the global community about ways forward. So it's that, if you like, and actually to argue that corruption is not still a major issue in China, I'm afraid that's not the case. And again, you could look at Chinese leadership statements, you could look at arrests, you can look at how entrepreneurs feel about their relationship with the Chinese government and the way in that is changing and so on. There is a great deal of social turmoil inside China, I would argue. And the picture is a much more variegated one. And we need to be aware of that because we want to avoid the pitfalls as well as take the best of the Chinese model.
Thanks, Professor. Very interesting comment. Yeah, I think, even all the efforts that China has been doing to develop the country to increase the livelihood of the people, I think, still China faces many challenges. And one of the proof is what President Xi Jinping announced 2 months ago, really, this idea of the common prosperity, really how to make all people beneficiaries of the rapid development. And still China faced many challenges. But I think one of the things that President Xi Jinping said during this 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly, beside what Ambassador Capuña said, this global development indicator, he said, and I am reading, that Xi Jinping announced that China will not will new coal-fired power plants approach. Yeah, because as you said, China was the world's largest public financer of overseas coal plants, but I think China has already said no, because China recognized that.
Yes, but Professor Aquino, he didn't give any dates on that, and he didn't say whether the current contracts would be cancelled. And that's what you have to be, as an academic, you need to be skeptical about whoever makes statements. You need to investigate, you need to think about, the failures of implementation as well as some of the things that do get implemented. And it's great that he said it, but it again, it needs specification. It needs more detail before we can.
Well, in the same note that I am reading, it says that 3 days after Xi Jinping's speech, the Bank of China declared that it will no longer provide financing for new coal mining and power projects outside China from the last quarter of 2021. But yeah, you're right, Professor. You have to see facts.
We do.
It's very, very interesting. Well, we have no question in the chat, but in Facebook, there is a question. Let me see. Here. Some person asked, does China respect international humanitarian law in parentheses, limits and avoid human suffering in times of armed conflict? I don't know if this is qualified as a question or a comment. I don't know.
I'm sorry, I missed
okay, I
a
will
part
do
of that.
Yeah.
Repeat, please. Yeah.
Does China respect international humanitarian law and in parentheses, here's right, limits and avoid human suffering in times of armed conflict?
Well, it depends how you think about this. I mean, it depends what you think about where there are breaches of international humanitarian law. Would you expect China to play a leading role in helping to organize a response to those serious breaches of international humanitarian law? I mean, there have been serious breaches inside Syria, inside Myanmar now, inside Yemen. The cases are many. But China would not play a leading role, would it, in terms of actually trying to organize an international response? Yes, it would probably talk about the importance of political dialogue and negotiation and the like. But you have to also take hard decisions about how you give effect to that, how you actually get a serious political dialogue going, how you get serious negotiation being undertaken. And if you've signed up to international humanitarian law, as China has and many other countries have, then there are mechanisms in place that you can use to bring to account particular governments or individuals or non-state actors or the like. But we don't see China playing that particular role in world politics. It's much too concerned about the idea of interference or the idea of intervention. Of course, it hasn't joined the International Criminal Court. I mean, neither has the United States and others. Russia have not. But that is a mechanism that can be used, has been used, in order to address some of the most egregious violations of international humanitarian law. But again, I would not expect China to play a leading role in this area of policy.
But as you said, Professor, China is the largest provider of member to the United Nations Peacekeeping Force. Perhaps China will have to be in the future. But of course, it's not that easy issue. They have to have the command, the permission of the United Nations. It is not easy for a country giving a member of the peacekeeping force to act by itself. You have to act on a common command. Yes,
I mean, it acts, yes, within, in terms of, it provides about 2,500 troops. It's the largest of the P5 members in terms of troop contributions, but and it's about 10th in terms of the, if you looked at the ranking of all countries that provide peacekeeping troops, it's about number 10. So countries like, some African countries, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and so on, have played major roles in providing peacekeeping troops, many more than Chinese. If you did it on a per capita basis, the Chinese contribution is very small, of course, in terms of the size of the PLA and so on. So, there are different ways of thinking about that. I mean, I regret very much that Western countries have given less attention to the provision of forces for the peacekeeping operations that the United Nations runs. Obviously, there have been peace operations that have been outside the UN via NATO forces and the like. But I think that it would be advisable for Western countries that have said that they wish to play a more prominent role within the UN setting, if they thought about this matter of peace operations and what they can contribute to those operations. So yes, again, two cheers for China, if you like. It gives more troops, it provides more troops than the other P5 members. It has a standby force, but the numbers that are offered are actually quite small. And most of them, I have to say, are in South Sudan. So out of the 2,500 peacekeeping troops that China provides at the moment, roughly 2,500, I think something like 1,100 are in South Sudan, where China, of course, has huge economic interests and a role in the oil installations in the country and so on. So there is a relationship between China's interests and its provision of peacekeeping troops that we need to think about as well.
Certainly. There is just a question in the chat. In your opinion, does China currently respect human rights in their country? Or does China prioritize security? It is in the chat.
Does he mean? Does that person mean in your?
I guess in his own country. I suppose in his own country.
In
Do you read, Professor, the question in the chat room?
Let me just have a read of it. Yeah. Does China currently respect human rights in your country? Does China prioritize security? I don't know what that means, really. I mean, does it? I mean, in terms of thinking about human rights, China thinks about it in relation to its own society much more than it thinks about it in relation to countries overseas. It would, inside its own society, as I said before, it thinks about human rights as something that is, again, provided by the state, guaranteed by the state, and that, that if it's not a right that you claim as an individual or as a group, it's something that is provided by the state, that it's the state that determines your rights. And of course, they would now argue that it's determined by your developmental stage. So I think they think much more about how to define human rights in their own terms. They also talk a lot about countries having to find their own way in terms of how they think about rights. And therefore, the idea of universality is something that's being downplayed in terms of Chinese formulations on rights. And I think the mention of the word security perhaps is pertinent here, because, I mean, part of the reason for this, obviously, is about protecting the political regime. I mean, China spends an awful lot of money on domestic security, more than it actually spends on external security. And therefore, there is a sense in which this is a government that is both powerful, influential, proud of its achievements, but also a government that feels insecure and that depends on regular good performance, if you like, in order to retain loyalty of the population rather than a wider sense of rule by right, if you like, or rule by authority or legitimacy. So there is a relationship between security and human rights that's interesting to explore here.
Thanks, Professor. Well, I think we have covered the question that we have in the chat room, the Facebook. We don't want to abuse Professor Reshape time. It's been already 1 hour and a half. Thanks, Professor. You are very kind. I don't know if you want to say something, final words.
No, I think it's probably about the right length of time for a Zoom conversation. I'm very, very pleased to have participated and to hear your perspectives on these things. I genuinely mean that. It's very important for me. Yeah.
Just allow me to say some words in Spanish. Sorry for finishing.
Yes, of course.
Bueno, amigos, vamos a terminar, pero antes quiero invitarlos. La próxima semana vamos a iniciar una serie de conferencias sobre Japón, ¿no? Un ciclo de conferencias sobre Japón. Están invitados el 21 de octubre. Vamos a empezar conferencias. Ya verán la publicidad en nuestra página de Facebook. Okay? Yeah, I was saying, Professor, that I invite you, but it will be in Spanish. We're going to begin on October 21st a series of conference about Japan. So But we have a conference on English on October 28th. A Japanese professor is going to talk about the Quad, no, the Indo-Pacific.
Oh, right. Okay, good.
That is of interest to you. Again,
Yeah.
Professor, thank you so much. Professor or Ambassador Juan Carlos Caponial also thank for your comments, and we hope to have both of you again in the near future. Just if you allow, we have a group picture, if you allow us. So if you can open your camera, please, we can take a picture. Okay. Okay. Yeah, the person who wants to have a picture. Okay, there are some friends over there. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, okay, we have the picture over there. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Kind for your time, and let's meet again. If there is a
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. Nice to meet
Thank you
you.
very much.
Very nice to meet you. Thank you, Ambassador Copina and Professor
Thank you.
Aquino. Very,
Thank you.
very grateful. Thank you.
Pleasure to
Thank
meet
you
you.
for attending. Okay, bye-bye. Bye.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Yeah.